When the Third Reich finally started to collapse, the world had to keep on existing and learn about a war that took millions of lives. Even criminal leaders of the Holocaust, the Nazi state, were arrested, charged, and rightfully tried for persecutions and offenses. But amidst the hunt for justice, a problematic question emerged: what to do with the youth that embraces Nazism? In many cases, these young men and boys had been swept and recruited into Hitler's war machine, so to speak, right from their childhood. Most of them were soldiers or officers. Others had been involved in heinous crimes during the war. For them, the war did not finish. Even the German military faced heavy destruction. The Nazi youth faced unforgiving punishments on the basis of documented evidence against the brutality and inhumane war acts committed by the Hitler Youth. America's military justice not only crushed the mere existence of the Nazi young blood, but also left influential marks of supreme dominancy over the global war tribunals. Welcome to the Marshall Memoirs. The rise of Hitler Youth and Nazi ideology. When Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party came to power in the early 1930s, one of the primary agenda was to ensure that a generation of Aryan superior race would uphold and sustain the Third Reich's vision of German dominance. This was achieved by recruiting youth, and to do this, the Hitler Youth or Hitler Jugend was made an essential part of the Nazi ideology. The Hitler Youth was not a novelty idea in Germany. National or military youth organizations were not innovations of the Third Reich, but it was Hitler who turned them into a genuine instrument of propaganda. The movement was initially slight early in the 1920s, but experienced a massive influx when Hitler was elected as Chancellor of Germany in 1933. The goal was to bring up German children and shape their minds in a Nazi manner, and produce obedient citizens who would gladly sacrifice themselves in favor of the Führer and his vision of the German fatherland. In 1936, it was made a mandatory step by Hitler for all German children above 10 years of age to get enrolled in Hitler Youth Acquisition. At the end of the 1930s, millions of boys and girls were learning in scout schools. It was understood that boys were prepared for future and immediate military service. At the same time, girls through the League of German Girls were ready for motherhood and performing suitable military services from home. This was not an activity outside the classroom. It was a complete and thorough system of political education, the primary purpose of which was to create hatred for the other race, militarism, and submission to Hitler. Child indoctrination began at the earliest time possible, and children aged 6 years old were enrolled in the German Young People's League, Deutsches Jungvolk, the youth wing of the Hitler Youth. The purpose was to cut off the young generation from any value or belief that could potentially disapprove Nazi culture. Education, especially school education, turned into an institution where kids were being fed with prejudices of racially pure Aryan, the superiority of Germans, and painting Jews, communists, and other people as enemies of Germans. The Hitler Youth's proposed agenda demonstrated warlike education for youth. Boys were trained in using weapons, war dancing, and discipline embraced by soldiers. Often they were exposed to strict physical drills, and this fostered brutality. This environment produced a generation of boys who were mentally and physically ready for war, with little or no consideration for mercy. Nazi leadership, notably Hitler, considered that young minds can be manipulated to idealize superior Aryans, brutal, cruel, and obedient to Nazi germs. During his campaigns when he was formulating the new Germany, Hitler declared many times that to gain power, gain the control over the youth. Hitler Youth in war efforts. When Nazi Germany declared war in 1939, the Hitler Youth shifted from a propaganda and training organization to a military organization. The younger boys were anxious to offer military services at various war fronts, having been through compulsory education teaching the idea that it was the boy's duty to serve his country, which, to all intents, was the fatherland. During the gaping years of the war, Hitler Youth members, in their capacities of communication aides, firefighters, and factory hands, supported the war machinery robustly. As the war proceeded to the next level and Germany faced severest setbacks, the Nazi leadership started to deploy even younger boys in actual combat. In 1943, due to the increasing losses of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front, boys aged 16, 17, and even younger began being mobilized into the standard military formations. The situation turned more critical in 1945, at the last stage of the war, when boys under 12 years were taken to the battlefield and made to fight in the war. One of the most well-known cases of Hitler Youth's participation in hostilities was during the Berlin defense in April 1945, when youths were equipped with Panzerfausts, anti-tank weapons, and told to hold the position against the Soviets. These children were practically incapable of operating heavy weapons. They almost had no training but merely a belief in their cause, which was insufficient to handle the professionally trained Soviet soldiers. Many young boys lost their lives hopelessly in futile attempts towards the possible collapse of a unit. Although some of the young people in the Hitler Youth might have been taken as victims of the Nazis, many of them actively participated in the war crimes. A large number of Nazi youth were found guilty of involving brutal treatment of prisoners of war and civilians alike. Some young people were part of the Waffen-SS, which was an operational arm of the Nazis' party's military wings and directly involved in the extermination of Jews and other minorities. A popular unit, for instance, was the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, comprised of young men from Hitler's youth organization. Engaged in many war crimes, this division killed Canadian prisoners during the Battle of Normandy in 1944. These young soldiers, which had been trained to be violent throughout the years, willingly tortured innocent civilians in the name of the Nazis. The end of the war. The Allies' hunt for war criminals. As the Second World War came to a close in May 1945 in Europe, the victorious Allied forces geared up to hunt for the war criminals. When the German command was collapsing and the Reich was in ruins, the Allies decided to make sure that those who had prepared for the Holocaust would be held accountable. World War II had witnessed a lot of brutality, quarantined murders, concentration camps, and the massacre of millions. Thus, the process of capturing and trying the culprits was started. At the end of the war, as the Allies entered Germany, they were able to understand all the atrocities of the Nazis. The deliberate freeing of soldiers uncovered the worst acts of genocide by shooting millions of innocents in concentration camps, including Auschwitz, Bergen-Belsen, and Dachau. The evidence was undeniable. There were direct orders, which were backed by documented evidence and mass graves, which indicated that there was a state-directed genocide. There was an urgency to the call for justice, but the question remained, who will be responsible for it, and how? The leaders of the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France decided that they would apprehend and try the most significant Nazi officials in the most extensive and most complex military trials. Of these processes, the most popular was the Nuremberg trials, which took place in 1945 to 1946, where Hermann Göring, Rudolf Hess, and Albert Speer were tried for war crimes, declaring them responsible for initiating criminal orders against humanity and crimes against peace. But the aim of punishing the Nazi criminals did not end at Nuremberg. As the Allies started arresting people for war crimes, people understood that many of the culprits were juvenile delinquents. For the American forces, who were tasked with overseeing a large portion of Germany after the war, faced a difficult situation regarding the fates of hundreds of thousands Nazi youth participants. During the early days after World War II, there was no time for compassion, given the apparent existence of cruelty that the Nazis perpetrated. The US military tribunals, as instituted, were supposed to be fast and efficient for those who had engaged in mass killings, running concentration camps and using slave labor. They had little excuse if they were involved in those criminal activities. At the time, the culture was to blame these young men and hold them own for the actions they carried out, even if the Nazi government gulled them. This was demonstrated by the trial of members of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, a military formation that included nearly all Hitler Youth. This division did some unforgivable things during the war. In particular, they killed 53 Canadian prisoners of war during the Normandy campaign in June 1944. Most of the division's members were teenagers, but they were savages who could kill others without second thoughts. And, as in these cases, the US tribunals demonstrated little mercy. The defense of expecting these young soldiers not to be held to the same criminal accountability standard as older soldiers, or citing the propaganda that filled their young minds, could not save them. But all Nazi youth were not treated with such severity. As the trials conducted by the US military continued, reports emerged about little difference between the victim and the culprit. Some young men overloaded Nazi rallies and committed crimes willingly. In contrast, others were forced to join the service and even commit criminal activities with threats of repercussions, which included death if they disobeyed. The Nuremberg trials, major figures and adult Nazis. In the aftermath of World War II, people of the world had been shocked by these monstrous crimes committed by the Nazis. The Allies decided to initiate the brutal executions of the war criminals in a way that all the Hitler Youth were brought to justice in the military trials. The trials were conducted in Nuremberg, Germany, because after the bombings, the city was destroyed, but the courthouse remained standing. Nuremberg was also the site of Nazi rallies. The Nuremberg was the major trial that was, for the first time, set by the International Tribunal to punish numerous war criminals. The first and most famous was the trial of the major war criminals, which involved the prosecution of 24 of the most important figures of the Third Reich. These people were charged with some of the worst forms of offenses, such as being in contravention of the laws and regulations of humanity, acts of warfare and acts of hostility. The core objective of the Nuremberg trials was the desire to punish those who had planned and directed the Nazi regime, those who started the war, exterminated European civilians, and enslaved millions of people. The most recognizable face was Hermann Göring, head of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, and the deputy of Hitler. The muscular and imposing Göring claimed not to have regret for the atrocities done under the Nazi regime, and thus became one of the most renowned defendants. He was also sentenced to the death penalty, but he hanged himself to death before the actual time came. Others among Göring's fellow senior officials include the former deputy of Führer Rudolf Hess, the Reich's minister for both armaments and war production, Albert Speer, and the Reich foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop. These men, the political, military, and economic leaders of the Third Reich, were presented with incontrovertible evidence of their participation in crimes of war. What distinguished the Nuremberg trials from any other proceedings in a law court of any nation before it was the types of accusations. For the first time, international law enshrined crimes against humanity, and genocide was declared as a prosecutable crime. The indictment against Nazi leadership was tight and included documents regarding the functioning of the concentration camp and witness testimonies of concentration camp survivors. The tribunal comprised 6 judges, 3 from the United States of America, and the other 3 from Great Britain, the USSR, and France. For prosecuting the top leaders and officials of Nazi Germany, it also wished to make sure that it would not be the only time and that other people would not be tried for the same offense in the future. At Nuremberg, there were different verdicts. Out of the condemned 12, Göring was one. They were hanged and executed. Some, like Speer, were duly given long prison terms because of their roles with the Walter Ration, a part of the Nazi war machine. Finally, some defendants were set free, which did not clear the names of the charges on them from the society's eyes. The Nuremberg trials were considered the first attempts to deal with matters in international law and the concept of responsibility for genocide. The important thing was how to deal with these criminals of war, such as the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend. The Allied tribunals asked whether those people shall be treated like victims of Nazi indoctrination or criminals, which led to different rulings. The trials described complex legal and ethical concerns of responsibility, particularly of the young offenders. By the early 1950s, hundreds were being tried, a process that established legal precedent for international justice and the period's concentration on moral accountability for war crimes. The United States military tribunals and lesser-known trials. As much as the Nuremberg trials can be considered the key cornerstone of post-World War II justice, they were not its culmination, but its starting point. In addition to the elevated, widely discussed trials of major Nazi leaders in Nuremberg, the Allies conducted countless minor trials, led mainly by the United States of America. These trials, conducted under the unified banner of United States military tribunals, involved not only the leaders of the Nazi regime, but thousands of individuals at lower levels, including the youngsters who got engaged in the process of war. While these military tribunals may not appear as often in historical discussions as the Nuremberg proceedings, justice needed to be served to many people who took part in the acts of the Nazi regime. These trials took place throughout Germany to prosecute individuals involved in various war crimes, including the operation of concentration camps and battlefield massacres. While the Nuremberg trials targeted German major leadership, United States tribunals were tasked with providing justice for millions of mid-ranked participants in the war production, administrative directors of maltreatment and killing camps, doctors who designed mass extermination techniques, and ordinary civil servants and soldiers who carried out brutal acts. One of the main difficulties of these United States military tribunals was the issue of what to do with Nazi youth. The Hitler Youth was a mass organization whose task was to educate children in the spirit of the Third Reich and turn them into followers of Adolf Hitler. Many of the young men who stood accused before the tribunals had been members of the Hitler Youth. At the beginning of the final era of the war and the collapse of German forces, younger boys below 18 were recruited to join the war effort. These young men were mercilessly thrown into the forefront or placed into formations such as the Waffen-Schutzstaffel, Waffen-SS, which played some heinous roles in that war. The issue for United States prosecutors to determine was whether these youths should be regarded as victims of Nazi propaganda or as willing accomplices of the Nazi regime. Most of the young men and women had grown into adulthood with a belief in Adolf Hitler's ideals of the supremacy of the Aryan race. By the time they were teenagers, they were ready to die for the Third Reich. These were the trial scenarios of young persons whom the tribunal was prosecuting for their involvement in the genocide. Allied Control Council Law No. 10 presided over the tribunals of the United States military, in which the accused Nazi youth were tried for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace. While cases were general, flexible provisions were made to suit particular circumstances. Much attention was paid to youth from the 12th Schutzstaffel Panzer Division Hitler Youth, who were intensely devoted to Adolf Hitler and actual participants in war crimes, such as the murder of Canadian prisoners of war during the Battle of Normandy. Most of these young soldiers were trained from childhood to be obedient and to view non-Germans as subhuman, which presented a paradox for the tribunals. Although some of the youths were treated mildly due to their indoctrination, those who were especially vicious were punished severely, and some even received death penalties. Nazi youth who aided in concentration camps, such as the Guards of Dachau, were also prosecuted. During the hearings in the tribunals, all those in concentration camps were held legally responsible for their actions regardless of their age or position. Such trials occurred against the background of post-war reconstruction, when denazification and the re-education of Germany were essential agendas. While not as famous as the Nuremberg trials, the United States military trials were critical in holding the Nazis accountable. These trials sought to understand how the Germans could commit such acts, showing that the Nazi regime had turned the young into obedient killers. The right approach was needed to extend justice without fully grasping what the Nazis had done to indoctrinate the Germans. The grim fate of Nazi youth. Key cases. Committed by the Nazis, war crimes were not only punished by the execution of the prominent leaders at Nuremberg, but also by many others, such as the well-known high-ranking officers, other representatives of the Waffen-SS, and the Hitler Youth who underwent American military trials. Described as one of the notoriously worse was the case of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitler Jugend, a military division that consisted almost entirely of former Hitler Youth soldiers. This division had zealously followed Adolf Hitler until the very end, and many of its soldiers, most of whom were teenage boys, were involved in several horrible massacres during the war. After the Normandy breakout in June 1944, members of the 12th SS Division were implicated in numerous war crimes, which included the shooting of Canadian prisoners of war. The elimination of all detainees in such areas was made by the Hitler Jugend Division, led by Kurt Meyer, a hardline SS major. The man called Meyer by his men was also nicknamed Panzer Meyer for his intense loyalty to the Nazi Party, as well as his military aggression. The crimes he committed were not just acts of violence, but they were calculated to instill fear in the Allies. Post-war, Meyer was imprisoned by the Allies and thus stood trial in 1945. In his defense, he argued that his soldiers were only obeying his command, a line used by most of the Nazi war criminals during the trial. However, Meyer tried to blame other people and retain subordinates for the crime. There was enough evidence against Meyer, and he was put to execution for it. However, his stiff penalty was eventually reduced to life imprisonment, and thus Meyer was released in 1954 after 9 years behind bars. Another critical case was that of participants of the SS Totenkopfverbände, or Death's Head, persons responsible for the management of concentration camps. Included among such guards were young men from the Hitler Youth who were drafted into service and turned into instruments of genocide for the regime very soon. One such person was Josef Clare. He was younger than most of the youth prosecuted. Though he was slightly older and received an education from the Nazis, Clare had been a guard at Auschwitz. In particular, he had been directly involved in gassing and subsequently murdering thousands of defenseless civilians. His attitude while performing these duties is one of the main reasons the survivors of the concentration camp wanted to see him punished. Clare was later captured and tried by the US military known as the Dachau trials because they concentrated on activities conducted in concentration camps. The witnesses at his trial stated how he became a mass murderer who had no qualms about the act he was physically involved in. Clare was sentenced to death, and in 1948 he was executed. Heinz Georg Linger was only 21 at the time, and he was a part of Hitler's bodyguard, the Leibstandarte SS. He was involved in the shooting of deserters and political rivals towards the end of the war in Berlin. Despite his age, Linger remained loyal to Hitler and provided the latter's defense. The US military tribunal, however, looked at him as someone who volunteered to be an agent of the Nazis, and he was hanged in 1946. Justice or retribution? America's moral dilemma. American military tribunals that started immediately after the war were aimed at participants on all levels, including such youth like these Nazis. This generated a new form of moral complexity for the American justice system. On one side, many of the crimes perpetrated by Nazi youth were absolute and incontestable. Some historical descriptions portray these young men as those that have been involved in the genocide of prisoners, operation of concentration camps, as well as other gross atrocities. At the same time, a large number of them were born and grew up under the Nazi dictatorship that inculcated their and neighboring European nations with the extension of Hitler's superior race and instilled obedience into young soldiers who blindly followed their commanders' commands. One of the most daunting tasks in attempting to understand the workings of the US tribunals was to decide how much of their responsibility the youths accused of war crimes should bear, knowing that they were brainwashed and their decisions were not made independently. This ethical dilemma was overlaid with pressure from a world that wanted anything related to Nazis punished immediately and severely. The audiences, particularly in the Allied countries, see the effects of the Nazi policy, and the people of those countries never wanted to be lenient with juvenile delinquents at all. It was an inventive activity that presupposed opposition and non-interference based on the liberal approach. Heinz Petri, a 19-year-old member of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend, was captured by American forces following the killing of Canadian prisoners of war in Normandy. At his trial, Petri was acting in his defense, saying that he was following orders and had been indoctrinated into the Nazi regime and culture of supremacy by force. But the tribunal that watched the gruesome nature of the executions sent Petri to the gallows. This grew out of the assumption of the tribunal that Petri not only aided his superiors in committing the acts, thereby being guilty of a war crime, but must be punished irrespective of age or indoctrination. Such incidences were not unique. Petri was not the only one. The US tribunals were involved in some trials of young men, most of whom had been in the Waffen-SS or had served as guards in concentration camps. Sometimes the tribunals found themselves on the horns of a dilemma, trying to do the right thing while fully understanding that the defendants before them were products of a system that thrived on deception and exploitation of young, vulnerable men. The tribunals could impose severe penalties, for example, death penalties or long-term prison sentences in some cases, and relatively mild sanctions in others when the defendant could present factual threats or attempted rebellion against the Nazi regime. This moral issue was further enriched with the context of post-war world politics. The Allies were not compensated to punish the Nazis for what they did to Jews and others suffering, but for rebuilding Germany and checking the spread of communism from the Soviet Union. With virtually the start of the Cold War, people were uncomfortable dealing with Germany's ugly past, as there was pressure to find some form of stability in Europe. Therefore, though many received longer years for associated criminal activities, similar culprits' jail terms decreased or pardoned exceptionally youthful perpetrators. Some members of the Nazi youth who were handed death penalty or lengthy jail terms were freed within a few years as the US aimed at constructing a new Germany. The US military tribunals were accused of vengefulness, if not justice, primarily when prosecuting Nazis' youth. Some claimed that these young men, as the result of education during the Third Reich from an early age, scarcely could exercise personal choice and did not have a meaningful understanding of what they were doing. They were outraged that the penalties given to them were severe and regarded the latter as a form of punishment for the whole group. But other people insisted that there was no difference in the sense they should both remain incarcerated because their actions of killing prisoners and running gas chambers were too despicable to be pardoned. The tribunals addressed the issue of post-war justice more so because they were called upon to do justice in the post-World War II, characterized by the impact of Nazi propaganda. The trials are still contentious today, provoking questions regarding justice versus retribution, psychological impact on Nazi youth and their defenders. The psychological repercussions of such processes of indoctrination were visible during post-war trials. Throughout the trial, several Nazi youth defendants expressed shock and confusion against the allegations leveled against them. They had learned all their lives that what they were doing was expected, even properly moral. Only the world outside the gated communities in which they lived told them this was murder. Independent observers of the trials also saw many of these young men as displaying the distancing and confusion characteristic of PTSD. The end of the Nazis and the subsequent arrest for many was seen not simply as a political or military defeat, but a metaphysical one. All concepts they had been taught consciously or unconsciously, all principles they had learned to defend, had been negated. This left them confused and helpless in understanding the nature of the morality of the actions they were taking. Perhaps the most shocking aspect of the trials was the young people's capacity to entertain no concept of what is unlawful or wrong, since the Nazis had dominated their initial moral personalities. In the minds of many of these defendants, their behavior was motivated by notions of duty and patriotism, the very tenets that the Nazi leadership had used to justify many of the worst behaviors exhibited by humanity. Apart from other things, the young captives who were tried in court often defended their actions by claiming that they just obeyed orders. This psychological conditioning made them near automatons in their adherence to the Nazi regime and became a significant part of their defense strategies for their attorneys. The defense teams that were assigned the specific responsibility of defending the Nazis' youths were in a fix. Their clients were involved in some of the worst crimes that the world has seen, including murder, rape, robbery, arson, and kidnapping. Still, they had been products of a system that sought to erase their capability of independent moral reasoning. Although the defense counsel defended alleged war criminals, they urged the court to acquit their clients by asserting that these criminals were victims of propaganda and indoctrination. They provided psychiatric studies that clearly showed how much these young people had been brainwashed. Among them, it is worth mentioning Erwin Metz, a former Hitler Youth and SS soldier who was conscripted in the last year of war to serve the defense of obeying the orders of authorities. Metz had been posted at a concentration camp known as Buchenwald, in which he had participated in the shooting of prisoners. His defense attorney, learning about all the incriminating evidence, insisted that Metz was a man who had been brainwashed from birth. He claimed that Metz was so brainwashed that he could not be held as fully responsible because of that. Experts that were presented in court said that Metz is emotionally detached, which is a clear sign of someone who has gone through ideological traumas of indoctrination. Despite the fact Metz was convicted, the argument given by the lawyers of the defense highlighted confusion common among young Nazis on trial. The case of 19-year-old Hermann Klemm, an SS member who played a part in mass killings in occupied Poland, illustrates critical issues of the moral and legal character of the prosecution of Nazis' youths. During Klemm's defense, his defense counsel explained that he was a mere boy when a Nazi ideology brainwashed him, and consequently claimed that such boys were trained to be killers. Thus, questions of free will versus brainwashing often arose when young men and women like him were put to trial. Barristers and many of the solicitors involved in defending the accused men were themselves ex-combatants who had to navigate personal and professional moral conundrums while representing such violence. Public opinion called for severe punishment, while psychologists and ethicists asked whether young men who had been brought up in the belief that war was glorious should be regarded as adult war criminals. The psychological outcome regarding Nazi youth showed that they became confused as to what extent they were guilty. These trials still raise questions about justice, ethics, and control of defenseless minds. Public opinion in the USA and Germany. Reactions to the fate of Nazi youth. During the trial periods, public opinion in the United States was significantly in favor of the Allied mission about the prosecution of Nazi war criminals for their crimes. It was the Nuremberg trials, which were again very much covered by the media, that put people into a position to understand the full overture of the Nazis' evil deeds. As people learned more and more about the specifics of the Holocaust, forced labor camps, and systematic genocide, the people of America became more and more outraged. Thus, the idea of punishing the leaders and followers of Nazi, Germany, and other subordinates regardless of their age was something that was deemed suitable by most of the Americans. The Hitler Youth, as far as the people of the United States were concerned, was seen more as a powerful wheel in the enormous Nazi war machinery. The news stories portrayed their function of fighting to the last breath for the Third Reich, as well as for committing heinous acts. Still, the image of indoctrinated youth of the Third Reich zealously following Hitler's orders would be a travesty to the American spirit of liberty and American democratic principles. But there have been opinions in the legal and intellectual circles in America regarding the fairness of prosecuting Nazi youth. Some defense lawyers, writers, and human rights activists insisted that these young men were the victims of Nazi propaganda and indoctrination, members of an evil system that turns the young into obedient tools of a totalitarian state. They argued that the treatment of indoctrinated youth in the same way that was used for the other adult war criminals did not consider the moral relativity of the subjects. Such critics thought that the US was likely to turn the post-war tribunals into a sheer trial of the defeated and reduce the trials to sheer retribution without sufficient regard for the psychological condition of the young people who had been subjected to Nazi propaganda for years. However, such views were relatively rare. Most of American society perceived the prosecution of Nazi youth as a continuation of the processes aimed at eradicating the remnants of the Nazi regime and fascism in particular. To that end, many Americans believed that any individuals who had played some role in the Nazi regime needed to be punished for justice to be delivered appropriately. During the early post-World War II period, Germans' views on legal proceedings and punishment of youths involved in war crimes were more or less polarized. The whole of Germany felt the oxygen lost once the Third Reich government was over and depressed with the war crimes that had been perpetrated. In the context of Germany, it was more like a feeling of denial because people did not want to face the horror of the Holocaust, and for some, serving justice meant reiterating their suffering through the prosecution of Nazi youths. Often they treated these young men, especially the members of the Hitler Youth, as victims of the perverted regime into whom the set of ideas was instilled and who had no choice but to serve the government and could not think or act otherwise. The Hitler Youth possessed their status in German society. For many families, it was a tangible and immediate story. Even though some of the members had been involved in crimes, many Germans could still sympathize with them, and hence perceived it as unfair to punish them as a measure of addressing what was a social calamity. On the other hand, some Germans, and particularly those who had been in opposition during the time of the Nazis, were in support of the prosecution of Nazi youths because justice had to be done. Therefore, the Allied forces, especially America, were faced with the question of how to punish Germany and, at the same time, reconstruct it. Even though they realized that strict discipline could breed contempt, they also realized that over-forgiveness would bring a lack of responsibility. Therefore, among the enemies of America, concerted action occasionally led to less severe punishment for those who committed their crimes under compulsion. Offenders directly involved in acts of savagery received strict punishment through military courts. The general public's perception of Nazi youth changed with time. As Germany moved to rebuild in the 1950s and joined the Cold War in the 1960s, the concentration was more on forgiveness. Numerous of the early released former Nazi youth were prisoners, and they were released early to help to bring more stability to Europe after World War II. The younger generation of German people started asking questions about Nazi crimes in the 1960s. It started looking at the past and present, drawing a different sensational picture of Nazi youths and their participation in the regime, such a shift characterized by general processes of post-war justice, guilt, and memory. Post-war reflections: were the trials just? Soon after the war, the process was viewed as a justified action of making the Nazi regime pay for inhumanity without parallel. As for the majority, there was no choice but black and white. Nazi war criminals were guilty of some of the most heinous crimes in human history, and it was thought that these Nazi people deserved to be punished as harshly as they could to keep fascism at bay. During those periods, people, mainly from the Allied nations, supported the executions and imprisonments that occurred from these trials. The tragedies of Shoah and war criminals still concerned people, and it was a common feeling to punish evil. Unfortunately, the humane and rational approach did not become dominant. Nonetheless, when the war years' ardor was over, historians turned their critical eye to the equity of these trials. Others claimed that raising young Nazis was problematic in terms of ethical practices, the issue of indoctrination. The majority of youths involved had been socialized to embrace the Nazi ideology from a young age, with the society celebrating Hitler and his ideals. The Hitler Youth had been conceived to produce obedient followers of the Nazi Party, and by the time these youths had reached their teenage years, they learned to hold the support of the regime. Because of this, some historians started observing that the penalty given to these young people could be overly severe because the accountable subjects could not think for themselves, having been socialized into a totalitarian milieu. This line of thinking has led to a more extensive discussion regarding the right to punishment of said individuals put on trial for war crimes and atrocities committed during the Holocaust and other acts committed during 2800 World War II. Some attested that the Nazi youth were deserving of sympathy, that is, for victims who fell prey to a Schwarz, 2003 Hitler regime that brainwashed young people and employed them to the Nazis' ends. On the other hand, some people agree that each of the youth, irrespective of his age, had to answer for the sins he committed knowingly and willingly, especially when these sins consisted of participation in acts of war and other forms of cruelty. This view is that although consideration should be given to indoctrination, it is not an excuse that can be used where there are moral repercussions regarding an individual's actions. Another crucial issue with attempts to reassess these trials from the vantage point of the victor's justice must also be mentioned here. Some scholars have observed that the Allies, especially the United States and the USSR, have tried to bring justice to bear on the vanquished Nazi regime while ignoring the peculiarities of the cases under consideration. Some critics have also pointed the finger at retribution, saying that the Nazi youths were similarly handled as war criminals. Some of the young Nazi soldiers dying on the gallows could have been as young as 17, and therefore the practice could have been motivated by the bent of the Allies to bring to justice the whole of the Nazi regime. Historically, the concept of justice has transformed, and contemporary debate seems to have shifted to the social-psychological perspective of human behavior. The Nazi youths, as many of them are products of years of propaganda and military training, have perfectly captured the umbrella issues of liability in totalitarian systems. Today, the trials must be seen in the broader context, as people pay more attention to the subtle factors involved. It is further admitted that, as regards the organization of initial accountability, the need for it has not been questioned. Yet, the attempt to solve a highly tragic and ethically ambivalent situation by putting on trial the perpetrators who were brainwashed and incarcerating them for life might have been an overreaction. Therefore, discussions of the post-war desire for punishment of Nazi youth through trial have raised and continue to stimulate questions about justice, guilt, and deserved punishment. While these trials were perceived as justified immediately after the war, the historical experience was marked by a more critical view of whether these young individuals were given fair treatment or if their punishment represented the retribution stage of post-war justice. Thus, the progressive stance that one takes towards these trials remains significant in comprehending the notion of justice in light of ideological orchestration and ethical cogency of warfare. The legacy of Nazi youth and American justice. During and after the war, the Allied forces were faced with an extraordinary dilemma: how to cope with the discipline and control the thousands of young Germans who had been thoroughly imbued with Nazi tenets. The Hitler Youth and other comparable organizations had consciously molded the ethical and ideological standards of the youngsters. They prepared them imperatively to be obedient followers of Adolf Hitler and zealous combatants in warfare. Indeed, some of these youths had been consciously engaged in crusades and had committed assorted heinous acts of their own volition, while others were massed rank-and-file fighters who stood their last ground in the Third Reich. These youthful persons posed a puzzle to the US military tribunals and other Allied courts: whether these young people deserved to be treated as victims who were brainwashed and fooled by the Japanese regime, or deserved to be punished severely as befitting criminals. Most of these young Nazis faced ugly music during the Nuremberg trials and other US military tribunals that followed, with a number of them being hanged and others imprisoned for many years. The trials of adult leaders of the Nazi regime, such as Hermann Göring and Rudolf Hess, were much publicized. However, prosecuting those of youth was no less inflammatory. The treatment of Nazi youth in these trials eventually shaped the future of the US military justice system. The trials and executions of young Nazis were preceded mainly by how the US military was to approach future comparable wars involving children that have been brainwashed into such militancy. The issue of what to do with juvenile offenders of war continued to present itself in subsequent decades as the United States entered multiple wars worldwide, from the Korean War to Vietnam and others afterward. The experience of Nazi youth executions and now the awareness of the psychological effects of indoctrination and war trauma on youths makes them very prudent in forthcoming wars. Geneva Conventions, which were redrafted after the war, directly pointed at the treatment of children and innocent persons caught in the lines of fire in the course of a war, illustrating lessons drawn from the prosecution of youths. While these conventions were intended to offer civilians some degree of protection or consideration, children, along with women, were very much a focus of prevention. Women and children were firmly taken into consideration because children during wars are victims and yet are capable of becoming perpetrators through force or coercion. The US military, acting under the provisions of these international treaties, progressively resorted to a policy of reintegration rather than reincarceration of child soldiers, as warfare was recognized to socially and psychologically harm those involved, as well as the children variously used. The complete illustrated history notes that in Germany specifically, the Nazi youth executions were an issue, historical and topical. As one might expect during the period right after the war, many Germans saw these trials as a legitimate way to come to terms with the Nazi era, but opinions changed over time. The unrelenting with the young Nazis, most of whom were used by the regime at a tender age, started to feel too severe, especially given that they were now facing execution or imprisonment. In the 1960s and 1970s, it became progressively noticeable that the justice system of Germany of the post-war period had gradually shifted towards the establishment of rehabilitating rather than punitive intentions. The transition to rehabilitation also embraced a new paradigm shift, a cultural reorientation in the case of German society, which was more prepared to face the psychological and moral implications of the war than that of punishment. The execution of Nazi youth brought many debates because the whole prosecution system did not take into account the distinction between the process of indoctrination and exceptional youth vulnerability. The analysis of the Nazi youth trials has shown that it serves as an essential source of understanding the post-war justice trends both in the United States of America and Germany. These events helped the US in formulating its policy concerning military justice and their policies on the protection of children in war-zone areas. In Germany, they released a shift in culture and law by focusing on the rehabilitation of the offenders as well as reconciliation. These issues, which are even today the subject of ethical and moral discussion and represent concerns of both nations, are evidence that these trials have influenced the development of global justice and social systems.